What's up, fellow gamers? Phreak here. I'm a game designer on the Summoner's Rift team, and here to do a, to be fair, slightly premature preview on patch 13.14. The preview went up on Twitter. That is not completely final. We have Wednesday morning to do final touches if there's something that comes up that we maybe had an oversight or some bug or whatever else. But largely, our stuff is in. I, of course, am not part of every single change. There's some stuff I'm going to somewhat gloss over, but I'll deliver what context I can. I'll go for extra in-depth stuff on what I more specifically worked on. Let's talk about it. 13.14 is actually a very large patch. There's like 30 or so line items plus Nefiri coming out. So up first, there is sort of some top lane changes. So I'll give some context on this. There were two basic sub goals with top lane changes. One is a look at pro play where it's, hey, let's make sure that the pro play metagame, specifically in top lane, is in a good state where the kinds of champions getting played are what we want to make the game fun to watch. For many regions around the world, 13.14 is their playoff patch. I believe LEC is not getting off of 13.13 for the rest of the year. Some leagues can use 13.15, but basically this is one of the big postseason patches, which means we have 13.14 and for some context 13.15 to get a final look at the pro play meta and make changes for Worlds. So there's a pro play look to be like, hey, let's get pro play into a state that we like. My basic rule of thumb for support was 2-to-1 tank supports. I believe in pick rate at MSI, I led sort of at least part of pro play balance for MSI. I was specifically there for support, I know, and I think we got support at 62%. Melee support pick rate. This is counting Thresh and Rakana's melee supports, I think is fair. And so we could have gone out slightly harder, and then of course we start with mid-season, we start with the new season, and Yumi, of course, is there, and Melio is there. So of course there's work to be done to get back to 2-to-1, but the goal for support was 2-to-1 melee supports. That to me is like the pro meta we should like look to do. And it's like kind of okay if it's like, well, it's okay if like the number, like it's, for specific melee champions, that's okay. You still get a pretty good amount of variation. Melee, ranged, engaged, disengaged, whatever. Pretty good. We've actually seen Braum show up a lot more because I know that we're in more of a tank meta. Braum is good into tanks, and, then the game makes to evolve on its own. Generally, pretty healthy for supports. We're pretty close there. So in a similar world, I want to get top lane, right? So I'm tasked with pro play top lane. And okay, well, what I would like to see in top lane is at least 2-to-1 fighters. Now, what's interesting is I think tanks are very good for the overall health of the game in solo queue. I think it's really valuable to have just tanks in general. Like it can be out of top lane, it can be out of jungle, it can be out of support, it could be out of mid theoretically or bot lane theoretically. I've played my share of like Senna, Taric lanes and whatnot where like, the tank farms. Anyway, to get on topic, while I think tanks are really, 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 really valuable in solo queue, in pro play, I think it is good if any individual lane has the chance to solo kill, or in the bot lane case, duo kill their lane opponents. And that means you tend to have to go more toward fighters in top lane. And also, I mean, to at least like make it clearly viable that top laners, if like your team is a top lane carry, that there's a slew of good top lane carries, and that you'll actually tend to be against other fighters as well, so that you can kind of flex your skill, but that tanks should be viable. So anyway, this is all to circle back to say that the goal for top lane and pro play is that we see 2-to-1 damage-oriented champions compared to tanks. Gnar is special in that he's kind of both. He often builds really fightery stuff like Trinity Forces and Stridebreakers and Divine Sunderer, but he often then starts going into, he can go into more damage items with things like Black Cleaver. He can just go full tank with Randuin's. So he's kind of, I like actually pick him as an asterisk. I'm like, here's the fighter ratio, here's the tank ratio, here's the Gnar ratio. Gnar's like 15% pick rate. Anyway, this is all to say that one of the sub goals with top lane was look at pro play. And I know you've probably been screaming Geronda for a while. Like, what about Cassante? So we do want to do work on Cassante. There was a brief time where he was going to be my project for 13.15. Now it's back to the original designer who was on the work on that one. So we we are hoping to get Cassante changes in for 13.15. There was a time where there were going to be Scion changes in this patch because we knew we weren't getting Cassante in point 14, just to lower tank presence slightly in pro play. We ended up cutting that. Right now, from what we can tell from the last couple of weeks of data of pro play, top lane is pretty fighter heavy, which is good. Again, Cassante being like the really obviously present tank, but there's like 20-ish% presence Ornn, 20-ish% presence Scion, like 10-ish% presence Malphite. And that's picks and bans, so it's not, they're not in every game. Either way, this is like, hey, that was one thing. And so it was like, hey, take a look at pro play. And then another part of it was I wasn't really given a task like go raise top lane agency a bunch. I like tried to buy into it a little bit. But it wasn't really like, this is your sprint task, like go raise top lane agency by like 0.5% or something. Like if I was told like, hey, go just drastically increase top lane agency, like I could take more drastic tactics, but that wasn't really what I was given. And so let's start talking about like what you may have seen on PvE over the last couple of weeks, and then what got pulled, and what was almost in for point 13 and then wasn't, whatnot. So I'm going to run you down the rabbit hole of my thought process of what's going on top lane right now. Again, for pro play, I actually see jungler's path, like, when I care to, like, pay attention and, like, take notes, I tend to see jungler's path top in pro play more than they path bot, especially when the lanes are, like, Renekton and Gnar and whatnot, and obviously less so when it's Cassante, but Cassante is also pretty frequently banned. Regardless, even with the Cassante stuff, like, you still can do the Sejuani, Sejuani Renekton dives right at level 5, or you push the wave in, you're 6, they're 5, and you can still dive a Cassante, whatever. Regardless, I keep getting off topic. But pro play seems to be, when it's 2-1 fighters, actually there's a pretty healthy amount of attention played toward top lane. Now, let's talk about solo queue. Let's talk about top lane agency for solo queue. So there are 3, one of which is very bad, ways to try to measure agency. So one, which I really like in its simplicity, is simply correlating MMR differences, matchmaking rating differences in champ select with the team that wins. And this is a biased, although directionally pretty good, indicator of better top laner wins, or better mid laner wins, or better jungler wins, or better AD carry wins, or better support wins, right? Because at the end of the day, right, one person is the highest MMR in the game, and more often than not, when they're the jungler, they win, compared to when they're the top laner, or the mid laner, or the AD carry, or the support. It's a decent indication of the actual's role agency in winning the game. That over the course of tens of millions of games, patch over patch, you can have a really, really good look at like, okay, well, across 30 million games, it turns out that we could really reliably predict that better jungler wins more often than better top laner wins, right? Like, now again, there's biases. The biggest bias that I have seen that's really obvious is actually the selection rate of the role. Because if it only looks at MMR and one of you is autofilled, turns out being autofilled is way more important than whether you're, generically 100 MMR above your opponents or not. And so, for example, in preseason 2023, so in 1222 and 1223, when a bunch of new fighter and tank items came out, the pick rates for top and jungle skyrocketed, and that tended to come from bot lane and support queues, right? Like people stopped playing bot and support to go play top and jungle. Mid laners just kept playing mid lane for the most part. And that plummeted the agency of bot and support in that metric. Because suddenly a much larger portion of preseason ranked solo queue games are being played by autofilled AD carries, which means that no longer is MMR the determinant of which bot laner wins the game. It's who's autofilled determines which bot laner wins the game, which is obviously not the same measurement, but has to take the agency from somewhere. And so everyone else like took agency from bot lane essentially. And so there's really big biases there, right? But you can see it where it's like, if you look at Korea, Korea has a higher overall bot lane agency than in other roles. And you could say that, hey, there's other reasons like AD carry scales with ping, which I think is a reasonable thing. This is a class that tends to want to kite more than other classes, and they're really ping reliant because they are attacking then moving every twice a second late game. So that's probably not inaccurate, but also AD carry is a far more popular role in Korea than somewhere else like North America or Europe. And again, you have a very obvious correlation between popularity and agency using MMR as your metric. Again, it's an okay metric. It's directionally not bad, because if you sort of like say, okay, well, in this patch we made these changes, in this patch we made those changes, and if the Q health didn't change, then but you see the agency move, then you get something, right? It's directionally decent. Either way, that metric basically says jungle's number one, mid and bot lane switch places. Though for the last few patches, bot lane has been below mid lane, then top lane, then support. The second metric, which is horrible, is very blindly saying who has a gold lead. Okay, who's going to win the game? So if I said, hey, which role's gold lead? Like if you said, hey, top or jungle or mid or bot or support has a 1,000 gold lead on their lane opponent, which team would you bet on? Right, I give you one bit of data. I say their top laner's up 1,000 gold, or their jungle's up 1,000 gold, or their mid laner's up 1,000 gold. Which team would you bet on wins this game most likely? The answer is support, because your support's up 1,000 gold. You're winning by a lot because they only get assists. So if you have a support with 1,000 gold, they're up 70 assists on the enemy team, you're winning this game, right? So that's obviously a really biased stat, and it's completely useless. It basically heavily overcounts bot lane and jungle, because those are the roles that are farming assists because they're involved in other people's kills. And so, of course, their gold lead means the most, and it's completely useless. So that just overcounts jungle, bot, and support, and you can't use it for anything. Okay, the final one, which is actually much better, is essentially a prediction algorithm where it says, okay, I'm going to predict the winner of the game based on, you give me all the data on who has gold leads, who has XP leads, who's been playing better, like who's got the better KDA, who's been doing more damage, who's been, getting more kills and whatnot, and then using that to come and spit back out who's actually winning. And that one, I don't have an up-to-date report on. I actually only have it as of 13.11, so we need to get that. Basically, something broke in the back end. We're trying to get it back up, but in the meantime, I have like the more naive MMR one. But that one puts jungle as still number one, and then it puts basically top, mid, and AD carry all pretty close together. It puts them all pretty close together in terms of which role is the best. It's like the clear number one, and then 2, 3, and 4 are relatively close. It generally tends to put mid then bot and then top lane, but compared to the MMR one, it has it much closer together. My theory with some of the MMR stuff is also any lane where there's a lot of counter picks, right? It's turns out that the top lane who got red side is going to win the lane more often, not MMR, but getting red teams you can counterpick, Malphite into Jace. Whereas AD carries don't really have very strong counterpicks. Jungle and AD carry is pretty much the least counterpickable roles, on a 1-to-1 comparison, because just by nature, AD carries are actually in a 2-on-2 and junglers are in a 5-on-5. You don't actually 1-on-1, so the matchups are always going to be a lot softer. Counterpicks also, by the way, mess with MMR equals win because of other factors. But if you say, well, who's winning, who's getting more gold, who's outperforming, okay, you can account for all these, and it's well, yes, you are winning top lane, you are playing Rumble into Malphite, doesn't matter whose MR you have, you're up 500 gold from first blood and a minion wave. Okay, well, how does that do? What does that do for you? That was interesting because that one actually lets you dissect it by time as well. And so it's well, okay, what does a 500 gold lead on Darius mean versus a 500 gold lead on Kayle versus a 500 gold lead on Ashe versus a 500 gold lead on Zeri? And unsurprisingly, Kayle with a gold lead at 2 minutes doesn't do very much. She still loses every lane. So if there's an invade, she gets first blood and comes in with an extra amp tome or a longsword or whatever. Nothing really changes. But if you get it on Darius, he just starts chain solo killing his lane opponent and the game ends because Darius suddenly goes 8-0 and takes every objective and runs over the game in mid game. And Darius turns out he's really, really good at that. If you do a 25-minute measurement of who's got leads at 25 minutes, you actually have champions like Kayle and Trinity who actually have higher agency than even the strongest marksman. Now, this is the cherry picking top end here, but the really turbo gold scaling top laners actually eclipse the really turbo gold scaling bot laners like Zeri and Jinx via the my gold lead means I win metric. Obviously, on the other side of the table, you have champions, and this is again for late game, right? Early game kill doesn't matter. Late game kill really matters. If late game kill's ahead, she wins the game even more than late game Zeri wins the game from ahead. On the other side of the table, you have obviously the more utility focused champions, where it's like it doesn't matter if Ashe has no gold, she has Hawk Shot and Enchanted Crystal Arrow. Like she has a baseline valued utility that even if she's doing really really poorly, is still going to have some percentage of her kit's going to work. And to a similar extent, you have champions like Malphite and Tahm Kench and Cho'Gath, where so much of their success is innate to the kit, where it's like no matter how badly Cho'Gath is doing, he's going to have at least 6 feast stacks, and he can just feast the Renekton at the start of the team fight and throw it on a silence, and it's going to be at least something. Because I mean, compare a 0-6 Cho'Gath to a 0-6 Fiora. Which would you rather have? It is clearly 0-6 Cho'Gath, right? Same thing with Malphite, where it's like doesn't matter how screwed he is, he still has the ulti. He still is going to tank for a while. He's not going to die out of nowhere and get one shot unless he's leaning against the Sylas, in which case, yes, sorry, you're giving the guy's Sylas ulti. That's just going to happen. Sorry about that. Sucks to suck. And so anyway, this is what kind of pushed me into changes that were on PBE briefly in 13.13, which was taking a bunch of top laners and shifting their power budgets into gold income. And this was saying, hey, if it doesn't, like, if Malphite's going to be incredibly low agency because he always has Unstoppable Force from this kit, he has all this crowd control no matter what, okay, well, one, ganking for him doesn't matter because he still has the same ultimate, whether he has a Thornmail or not. The ulti does the same amount of damage and has the same amount of CC, and he's still not getting killed first in the team fight, so what does it matter? And the other side, if you are ganking for your Fiora or for your Rumble, denying that Malphite doesn't really matter because Malphite is still going to have Unstoppable Force. Doesn't matter what level his ultimate is. It scales the base damage, nothing else. He's still not dying first in the team fight. So what do you get out of denying that minion wave? And ensuring that Malphite can't fight back the 1v1? Well, very little, because there are tanks up in the top lane. Meanwhile, it's like, well, you look at bot lane, it's like, a decent portion of Ashe's power budget is still actually auto-attacking. Even though a large portion of her power budget is her crowd control, it's like, if you compare, Kayle to Malphite, right, here's Zeri to Ashe, right? And it's like, well, in agency, right? So in terms of, what should you gank? Well, in a world where people aren't going to play Cho'Gath as a farm bot laner, there's some obvious tautological stuff. And that's part of the agency thing as well, is at the end of the day, your agency, right? The prediction algorithm of better top laner wins the game. Part of that is winning your lane and thus your opponent losing their lane. But if your opponent is playing Malphite in 40% of your games, them losing their lane doesn't matter. Whereas if your opponent is playing Varus, them losing their game matters a lot more. And this will always be true unless we completely, absolutely ruin bot lane, which I don't think is fair to do. So that's the tough thing, is that's one thing that exists. It's like, okay, well, maybe we can actually make Malphite and Cho'Gath and Tahm Kench and all these champions and, pick the bottom 10 top laners and make them care a lot more about gold and make top lane a more snowbally lane. That might be the right choice. Again, my task was not actually raise top lane agency by 0.5% of the entire game or something, but if that was required, that might be a pretty decent tactic, and it's one that I think has some teeth to it, but is not something that we are doing right away. Though we are still aware that top lane is relatively low agency. Now, I am pretty sure, though, that if top lane is fighter versus fighter, it is a very, very relevant lane. It's only when it's top lane versus, when it's versus a tank or two tanks where there's not much reason to go there. And again, when I watch pro play, this appears to be true. So that is one of the weird constraints around a mathematical model of agency, is tanks exist in that lane. Support is unsurprisingly a low agency lane because what does a 2-kill Janna do? Pretty much nothing. It's interesting, you can actually really easily graph the fact that champions like Zyra and Brand and Xerath are much more popular in low elo, because you can track, like, hey, how much gold does the average support get? And every other role, if you... gold per minute grows with MMR, so top laners earn more gold as their MMR grows. They earn more XP as their MMR grows. Junglers, mid laners, AD carries, they all gain gold as they get better at the game, except support, which goes down and to the right because they play less Xerath and less Brand. And I find that kind of interesting, but it means that generally speaking, support is lower and lower agency, because it's not that, right, the better support can't win the game. That's a reasonable metric there, but in terms of like, oh, our Janna got 2 kills, it doesn't matter. That is an accurate statement. Okay, so this all circles back to we would like to give top lane some agency, even though it hasn't been a really dedicated, directed focus. Okay, well, here's the thing. I don't believe top lane as a lane is actually underpowered. I don't think the champions are structurally weak. What's also tough is there's a lot of experiential problems with top lane. So top lane is very snowbally, where it can be very quick to get to a point where, as a top laner, you don't get to play your lane anymore because Darius got first blood and the lane is just over. Or the even worse version, Rek'Sai tunneled under your wall and now you died in the 2v1. You had no way of doing anything about this because she went into your jungle and tunneled over, and so now you're behind first blood and you can't do anything about this. This can be a quite common occurrence. That is very much a pertinent solve. It's something that we were addressing at least a very little bit in this patch, though obviously not completely solved. It's also true that the one big objective in top lane, Rift Herald, is something that teams often, at least in pro play, rotate their entire team to. So it's not that top lane objectives aren't good, because they are. Pro teams will swap their entire bot lane out to play for it because they want it that badly. But it turns out that it's so good that it's not just about the top laners and the junglers, but also that whoever wins it can just further determine which top laner wins, because unlike getting, say, an Infernal Drake where everyone gets like 4% more attack damage and it's pretty diffuse, but it's like playing towards the late game, Dragon Soul objective. So it's kind of okay. If you're playing bot lane and like your opponent gets first Cloud Drake, you're like, yeah, okay, whatever, like we'll play the lane out, right? But if, your opposing team gets Rift Herald and then crashes your entire top lane turret, and the enemy top laner gets 400 gold from sharing first turret and like 2.5 plates, and I have no turret to defend yourself with, it's like, what are you supposed to do? So there are a bunch of experiential wins and losses to top lane that we cannot solve in an individual patch. Like, remaking Rift Herald is not happening in 13.14. That's not happening. Making top lane turrets deal twice the damage, it's not happening in 13.14, right? Like, there's a bunch of things that it would take a seasonal level update to do. And hey, if I was given at mid-season, instead of go update 80 carry items to hey, go raise top lane agency, maybe that could have been the exploration, but that wasn't the task I was given. If I'm given a task for preseason 2024, like Phreak, go spend a month and raise top lane agency, great, I'm about that, right? I'm super down to go do that work. But the more I looked at this space, it's like, well, there's really big structural things that are really hard to disentangle that I need more than 8 days to do. Or someone else needs more than 8 days to do as under the team. People are really heavily working on preseason right now. But I'm preambling more about top lane. We're just here on the screen for a very, very long time. Anyway, so one of the ideas was, hey, what if we gave top laners much more gold scaling? The difficulty with that is, again, I don't think top lane is specifically an underpowered lane. And so this would have to be power neutral changes, but they'd have to be power neutral shifts from baseline power to gold scaling power. People tend to see changes like that as negative. I have seen people call the Trinity Force changes from this patch a nerf to fighters, which, no. But anyway, it's even if changes or things that are positive but aren't obvious, people tend to take pessimistically. And so well, I'm actually not convinced that we can ship 10 top lane champion changes that people will see and be like, this is actually a buff to my champion. I think people will receive it pessimistically, and so I think it's a really tough thing to sell. Structural map changes cannot happen in a random patch in the middle of the pro season. Can't happen. I'm sorry. And so my hands quickly become very, very tied. What I can say is agency is a zero-sum game. And the experience of playing top lane can be shifted patch over patch, and we can make gains every 14 days. That is what I am trying to promise and try to push for as a designer on Live Balance. My input matters. The things I suggest and implement have a decently high chance of getting in, and so we can at least push in the correct direction here. My current theory of top lane is early game lethality is too high, especially in 2v1 scenarios. My belief is that top laners, in general, on average, need to scale with gold more, And so we need to kind of pair those, right? Because like your success determines how much like your success is based on how much gold you have, but you need to not die early as often. And so it's like this weird mix of like, well, we want people to spend more time looking at top lane, but top laners also kind of want their honorable 1v1 duel. That's tough to like have together, but we can kind of go in that direction still from both directions and still have like the end result be a positive experience for top laners. Again, the thing I was thinking before is that agency is zero sum. So if AD carries don't just dash away from Vi or Wukong as often, then fighters and divers can do their job of killing an AD carry. And if the AD carry is dead, well, someone else has to do the consistent damage. Enter Aatrox, enter Darius, enter Mordekaiser, enter whomever. Enter top lane Wukong, whatever it is, right? Additionally, if junglers are less powerful and jungle jungle is by every metric and including player surveys, jungle is overpowered. So it's like, oh well, if we commit to nerfing more jungle champions than we buff every patch, then over the course of 6 months we will have nerfed jungle by a lot, which means that their agency over winning the game goes down, and they have room to go down by a lot, which means that has to go somewhere else, and it gets spread apart to everyone else. I think the fact that AD carries have felt low agency for a long time, and mages have felt low agency for a long time, and top laners have felt low agency for a long time. It's like, at a certain point, this is 70% of the game, and then over here are the junglers who are eating far too well. It's like, well, what I can try to promise and try to work toward is a bunch of taps in that direction from all these avenues, all of which move towards a better top lane play experience, because I cannot just make Rift Herald spawn at 5 minutes, not kill turret plates, and do other stuff, right? Like, I can't make Dragon spawn up there, and this is just not something that I can do. This is not something we're going to ship in the middle of the year. So, very, very long-winded preamble on top lane, but that is a unstructured rant, soliloquy, whatever, on what I hope to accomplish in the short to midterm for top lane, and at least directionally go this way in trying to raise the role up. Again, I don't think there are silver bullets that aren't in a seasonal level impact or size of patch. So let's move on to the changes that are sort of actually happening in top lane. So there is a sort of set of changes to top laners. First up are some pretty large buffs to Aatrox. So Aatrox, even in elite level play, is like a 49% win rate champion. He is elite skewed. I am generally pretty comfortable getting Aatrox even as high as 52% in elite play. That would be a 3% buff. That would be too high, to be clear, but like he could go up to that high. And to me, that's like reasonably okay, but we're not targeting 3% here. Anyway, the goal is to buff Aatrox because Aatrox is a carry top laner. And the more carry top laners there are, the more that top lane has impact over who wins the game. I talked about agency earlier, where I said, you know, Kayle and Tryndamere and Darius, depending on game time, are up here, and Malphite's down here. Well, depending on how popular Malphite, Ornn, and Sion are, and how popular Aatrox and Fiora and Darius are, well, simple pick rates are going to shift the agency of the role. I talked about AD carry a second ago, where Zeri and Jinx were 1 and 2 in terms of the only things they do are deal damage with their gold income. Well, if they become less popular, other lower agency AD carries have to be more popular, and just shifting which champs are played will shift agency, because of course it will, right? If top lane was all Malphite Ornn, obviously top lane would be a lower agency role, right? So if we shift the metagame toward carry-oriented fighters, gold-scaling fighters, the agency of the role goes up because more of the champions are high agency champions. So this moves in this direction. Again, the experience of playing top lane is not magically fixed, but in terms of mathematical agency and how much it matters to win top lane and play top lane, this goes in that direction. It is a light touch, but it moves in that direction. So this is Aatrox losing some base damage on Q, gaining some AD ratio on Q. The math works out to it takes 100 total AD to equalize this build, which is if you're doing like an Iceborne Gauntlet build or an Even Shroud build. That's worse for you. If you're going first item Eclipse or Gore Drinker, or the real tech, by the way, is, folks, Stride Breaker Aatrox. Okay, trust me, Stride Breaker Aatrox. If you want Freelo, you can do it now. Especially do it 13-14. Stride Breaker Aatrox. Okay, just making sure you all are aware. Stride Breaker Aatrox is very, very good. Anyway, 100 total AD equalizes, and then from there on, it is a buff. It is, of course, up to a 20% AD ratio increase, which can be quite large, of course. This is, of course, a very big deal. It's definitely a very big buff. This is definitely quite large. The fact that it is skewed toward late game helps. The fact that it is skewed toward gold scaling helps. Directionally trying to get top into a state where their champions are good in the late game. Another theory I have, by the way, is that I don't think players are satisfied if the state of top lane is there are a bunch of early game champions who have to snowball their lane and then win the game at 20 minutes. Otherwise, the role falls off and they're glorified tank for the AD carries to win. I actually believe that even though that would create strategic depth of we play for top lane, and by playing for top lane, we're going to win early game and snowball that into a victory and win in 25 minutes. Though there is strategic depth there, I don't believe teams in solo queue will ever actually do this. And I also don't believe that people actually enjoy that game. And so I believe that it is better to smooth out the average power curve of each lane and still have champions like Yone who are big scalers, and champions like actually Sylas is much more of a like early snowball champion. Champions like Trinity who are very big lane bullies, champions like Kale who are very clearly late game scalers, champions like Darius who are lane bullies who want to snowball the game and end. That's fine to have these champions exist, but if we smooth out the average power curve of the role while still having things on either side, I think on average people enjoy that game more. We're like, oh yeah, sometimes actually bot lane is a snowball the lane to win the game, Lucian, Kalista, whatever, and top lane has some scalers, there's a Yone up there, there's a Kale up there, whatever, and sometimes it's the opposite where it's Renekton versus Darius and it's Aphelios versus Jinx. Having a good distribution of both of those sides I think is actually very valuable, and something that I think is very much worth doing. But again, that means we have to ensure that there are some late game top laners, and like who can you really name as a good late game top laner that isn't Kale, where you're like, I'm really looking forward to level 18 of this top laner. Like, there's not a lot, right? You're like, anyway, let's move forward. Jax is pretty good, but again, most AD carries are happy to have level 18 5 items, right? So directionally, slightly move in that direction over time. Cool. Experiential win, minion mod going up on Q. This is going to be same at level 1, bump it 6, 11, 16, where it's going to go from 55 to 60, 65, 70% total damage to minions. A 15 percentage point increase from 55 to 70 is a pretty big jump. It's almost a 30% damage increase to go with the big AD ratio increase in the queue as well, means a really substantial increase to the rate at which Aatrox can wave clear in the late game. It's a lot of late game power. Again, there is a chance this is over the line. There is a world where we have the micro patch at the beginning of 13-14. There's a world where we just nerf it a bit 13-15. I know Aatrox was a really huge pick at Worlds last year. The hope is that his early laning phase is still going to be fairly vulnerable, that you can go in and fight him, because until he gets to 100 total AD, he's objectively a weaker champion. He just does less damage than before. Obviously, it doesn't take long. It's like basically first recall get Serrated Dirk, or first recall get your pickaxe or your Iron Spike whip, and you're off to the races. But again, leaving the early laning phase as a little bit vulnerable, probably useful. Anyway, the next change is Volibear. Relatively small touches here. Volibear in the top lane, of course, not doing terribly well. This is a fairly large gold scaling increase. The missing health heal is going from, I think it's 8 to 16, is becoming 8 to 20% missing health. Experientially, this has felt quite good. The passive AP ratio going up as well. A pretty decent number of Volibear players actually do play AP Volibear, Nashor's Tooth, Riftmaker, items like that. And being that it's a relatively popular build, all the AP Volibears get 2 buffs. All the standard tank fighter Volibears only get 1 buff, but this is a pretty meaningful increase in the amount of health you get. 4% of your max health, if you can get the W Prime to start using it, is actually a pretty meaningful upgrade. There's also a quality of life here. This is largely aimed at AP Volibears who get a lot more attack speed, but the way the passive is coded, the way the Q is coded, I noticed this when looking at a bunch of his ability scripts, is he actually has it. After you land the Q, it waits 0.15 seconds, then runs some logic. One of the pieces of that logic is resetting your auto attack timer. So if you had really high attack speed, aka you're like Nash's level 18, close to full blood Volibear, you'd be hitting, you'd Q, you'd start your next auto attack, and then you'd hitch and start it over again. So that hitch there is gone, so high attack speed Volibear will be a lot smoother after using Q. You will generally not notice this outside of, again, Nashor's Tooth plus high AP builds, but for the late game AP Volibears. That is there for you. Congratulations. It's a very minor thing, but it's there. And as far as I could test locally, they didn't seem to mess anything up. The auto attack reset is already part of the queue itself. And then the next auto just comes at the normal time. So everything looks, as far as I can tell, looks normal. On low attack speed, you can't notice a difference. On high attack speed, you don't get that hitch. Seems really good. And so, yeah, it's a big buff to Wizard Bear. It is a moderate buff to Top Bear. Yeah, again, moving in the direction of the things that you earn gold to do are going up. A lower A to C top laner is going to scale more with his own gold income, and so if he can snowball, he can do a little bit more to carry the game out. I mentioned in the preamble that we're not doing changes to Scion. Ultimately, we're going to make Cassante changes in 13.15, fingers crossed. Scion is usually ends up being the second most popular tank in pro play, but we're at a pretty decent spot in pro play meta right now. It's not going to do very much. The other thing that we are doing is trying to increase systemically the late game carry power of top lane, and not just the fighters but tanks as well. And so it's Randuin's Omen, Spear of Shojin, Spirit Visage, and Steric's Gauge are all getting pretty meaningful buffs to these items. These are items that we identified as they are unpopular. They're underpurchased. So it's like kind of free real estate. Each of these actually serves a very useful niche. They do something very, very useful overall for the game. And by making these items stronger and more appealing, we can overall increase the carry potential of top laners by saying, well, you can grab a multiplier or a capstone item or some kind of very specific bit of power more obviously, either more quickly or it's more powerful, or you pick it up instead of something more generic to amplify yourself more. And so these were some of the big core multipliers. It was like, hey, I think buff some unpopular things. And we had a lot of other things in consideration. So, for example, we had a consideration for Silvermere Dawn, which is the fighter Quicksilver Sash upgrade, and ultimately decided after some discussion that this is an item we actually don't want to be good. If QSS is omnipresent, the game is actually worse for it. And this item being around is useful as an outlet for like, wow, I really want a solo carry, and they picked Malzahar, and I just want to be able to shrug this off. You're allowed to have a QSS upgrade, but the item is meant to be weak in most games and only situationally purchased, and it's basically an outlet for some kind of degenerate game state. I think it is reasonable if fighters have some sources of good tenacity that isn't in runes. I personally really, really dislike tenacity in runes. I also dislike I dislike most resource generation in runes. I don't like biscuits and mana flow band of presence of mind. I would rather that be on the kits themselves or require meaningful purchases like buying a catalyst or a lost chapter or a tier. And solving your mana issues that way, to me, that is my sensibility. So even though tenacity has been nerfed over time in the rune system this year, right, both unflinching and legend tenacity got nerfed this year, unsurprisingly, that would generally lower top lane agency because now they remain stunned for more of the team fights. I would like to give fighters a non-Mercury Treads tenacity item. I think that would be really valuable. It's something I think we should deliver at some point. I believe that. I'll pitch it for preseason. We'll see, but like, letting them opt into, no, I'm going to shrug off crowd control and play a longer team fight in melee range, generally positive. Of note, data seems to indicate that Mercury Treads are a slightly under-purchased top lane item. It can be hard to not buy steel caps against a Renekton or a Darius. I understand feeling hamstrung that you must build armor boots, and that's not necessarily wrong, but Mercury Treads are almost always incredibly, incredibly performant for top laners because it turns out having reliable tenacity is really meaningful for your ability to navigate team fights. And it might be that just needs to be in a spot that's not just Mercury Treads, but that was one of the initial pitches on like, well, what if we made Silvermere Dawn good because it has its tenacity after the active? And again, the amount that they would checkmate a mage by shrugging off the one and only stun and then just winning is a little unacceptable, and I think it's fair. But hey, Randuin's Omen, right? This gives top laners some agency. Hey, if you give your Malphite enough gold to finish a Sunfire Cape, a Thornmail, a Randuin's Omen here, hey, they're going to actually just be, I mean, not truly invincible, but hey, they're going to be a lot tankier against the enemy crit marksman. You can get a lot more done here. This is an item that pretty much no one is buying. They're buying Frozen Heart instead. So look, no, this serves a very specific purpose, and if you are playing a fighter and you really are dying to double marksman, right? Actually, a lot of the comps right now in pro play we're seeing a lot of Tristana plus Xayah, Tristana plus Ashe, whatever, and a lot of these double crit marksman compositions. Well, here's an item that helps you get around that a little bit. So I think very worthwhile buff. This is of course on the tank side. The fighters can of course grab it. Spear of Shojin, I think we definitely should be buffing. I wish we buffed this item a lot sooner. I really didn't identify this item was bad or underpurchased, but like this is clearly meant to be, I think, a very good fighter capstone. It's a big stack of attack damage, ability haste, health, and more ability haste. Like this is a stat profile champions should want, but it's really only a sometimes Jax items and a sometimes Hecarim item. We are nerfing both Jax and Hecarim in this patch because we know that they're already pretty good, and one of the items that they actually do buy is getting buffed, so they can go down as the item gets buffed, and everyone else can more readily consider Shojin as a I'm snowballing, I'm winning, let me buy this, and let me have a good capstone. Spear of Shojin, 100 gold cheaper, 50 more health on it. It's not a huge change, but hey, Spear of Shojin, a stronger option. More people are going to try it. This item is good, but again, I think this item should be tuned aggressively enough that I'm pretty sure Majai's is built more often than Shojin is, and it's like Shojin should absolutely be built more often than Majai's. To me, it's like this item should be a slam dunk purchase for I'm winning, I'm snowballing, I'm a top lane carry, let's go. So I'm very glad we're buffing this. Spirit Visitor going back to a tank option here. There's another item that was really, really underpurchased. Even on champions like Dr. Mundo and Volibear, you didn't see it as much. It wasn't just the default purchase. Flat MR here essentially saying that, hey, if you are one of the self-healing champions, if you're Mundo, you're Kench, you're Volibear, you're all these guys, Red Cane, maybe if he wants to go for a tankier bent. Visage is clearly your best MR option if you have a synergy here. This is the one you want to go for. Hey, you can go Abyssal Mask if you really care about giving the rest of your team some damage, or you're meant to damage dealer yourself. Hey, Force of Nature is clearly the option if what you care most about is running fast. And Spirit Visage is, hey, this is clearly the one for you if you're going to use that unique passive. And you're going to get value out of the self-healing, self-shielding going up, and so it's going to increase the number of users, it's going to increase the carry potential of these champions. It's slightly power positive, of course, and slightly directionally going towards your gold matters because you're going to buy better items with it. Sterix Gauge in the exact same boat, 100 gold less expensive, 50 more health on it. Sterix is very, very, very underpurchased compared to Death's Dance. I think it is very important that fighters have strong team fight output items because fighters' kits don't do a very good job of expressing themselves well in team fight. Think about like what Fiora tries to do. Fiora only wants to 1v1 somebody. And so it's really hard to do much of her job in team fights when she can kill exactly one person, then hope that her team can mop up the rest. It's really, Darius can sometimes get the snowball pentakill going. He has to like live long enough to get the 5 stack, get the ulti reset, and then once that happens, okay, now he's ready to go, and I can start applying bleed to everyone and start cleaning up. But that's the oddity, right? Like Darius does not print pentakills. I assume he has one of the highest pentakill rates of any top laner, maybe the highest of any top laner. But this is like even the snowballiest of top laners, Darius is still not a very good team fighter because he can't often live long enough to actually finish that job. And saying, hey, here's a really good team fight outlet item that like, no, really, you can buy this, get it second or get it third, right? You're going to have this fat shield you're going to be able to use, and you're for sure going to be able to survive the first half of this fight, tank it up and go. Cool stuff here. It's entirely possible that there are other ones that we could have looked at and didn't hit. We were looking at Titanic Hydra earlier. We ended up not going for it. I don't have 100% full context into why, but there was initially a longer list. We cut it down to these 4 that we were confident we wanted to buff by a moderate amount. And again, this does not magically solve top lane, but we get to go in a plus late game scaling direction onto champions. We get to go in a plus late game scaling direction on 4 items, and we get to nudge in the correct direction as saying, well, the late game potential of top lane is at least moving in the correct direction. We are at least going to dedicate to trying to push into a more equitable world for top laners. And it's not going to be overnight, but at least we're going in the right direction. I'm overstating it somewhat, but at least that is the goal because I don't see a silver bullet, unfortunately. So that's just the state we're in. Let's move forward, which is what I said earlier is that agency is ultimately zero sum. Part of the experience of feeling bad about playing top lane is jungles coming in and single-handedly deciding which laner is going to win the game because they 2v1 a top laner who's at half health and you just die. So there are a set of jungle nerfs here, which is red buff and blue buff getting nerfed early game. So red buff in currently the way red buff works is it's a 3-second long dot that is 10 damage total at level 1. And to be fair, you don't get a level in red buff unless your Twitch or Zyra steals buff level 1. So really it's a 16 damage dot at level 2. And it goes +6 per level forever until the very end at level, it's +4 per level. I don't remember. I think it's +4 per level. Whatever. Either way, it ends at 78, linear scaling from level 1 to level 18. That damage is now 10 flat up through level 5. And so, because I believe it is actually 4, 10, 14, 18, 22, 26. Yes. Yeah. Cool. It's 10, 10, 10, 10, 10. And so when a jungler ganks you on level 3 or level 4, their dot is doing literally half the damage it was before. Now, it's not a ton of damage, but over the course of like a 6 or 7 second long fight, right? That is 2 to 3 full distributions of the passive. Okay, well, that's like 70-ish true damage becomes like 30-ish true damage. That is a meaningful change. That is, it's not, oh my gosh, top laners can never die to ganks anymore, but it is a drop in the amount of damage the top laner is dealing to you for free when they gank you. The melee slow is getting nerfed up until level 16. So the range slow is 5%, 7.5%, 10% at levels 1, 6, 16. And that's unchanged. The melee slow on live is, I believe, 10, 15, 20 at 1, 6, and 11. That is getting dropped to 5, 10, 15, 20 at 1, 6, 11, 16. So essentially, it is a 5% lower slow from levels 1 through 15 on red buff, which, of course, nerfs jungle ganks. It also nerfs donating red buff over to AD carry, so there's even less power. Well, that's just not true, sorry, because they're ranged, so they don't get a change. The red buff burn is going to be lower on them when it gets duplicated with the global buff sharing, but regardless, still a little bit less damage there. But essentially, it's like, yeah, the slows for jungle ganks, basically forever, is just 5% lower. Now, of course, if they ever use offensive smite is a 20 or 30% slow. Either way, it's stronger than red buff ever has been, so there's never a difference there if you're ever getting smitten or smited, whatever verb you want to use. But the non-smite ganks, which is the first couple of rounds of it, right, until they get 20 treats done, which is the first 2 rounds of ganks and 2 rounds of buffs, most junglers are melee, and so most junglers are going to have overall slightly lower gank success via dealing a bit less damage and slowing a bit less as well. So a light touch to the amount that junglers can early gank, but it goes down directionally, trying to lower the power of jungle. Additionally, similar thing here with blue buff. Instead of it being 10 flat haste, it's now going to be 5, 10, 15, 20 haste at levels 1, 6, 11, 16. This will slow down jungle clears a little bit, as will less damage on the burn, of course. But it also means that, hey, the Elise getting a second round of cooldowns in a long gank, or Wukong getting a second Q, or Rek'Sai getting a second Q activation, or whatever, is going to be a little bit less likely. Or even something like, Vi burned her Q to finish off the Krugs and comes around to fight you at the top river. Missing that 5 haste means Q's not quite back up just yet. Very minor thing. But, it very, very lightly slows down jungle clears. It very, very lightly slows down tool access when ganking any given lane. But, top lane certainly is some of it. It is, again, light touches, but something that the jungle can easily withstand as the most performant role in the game. And long term, we actually are going to keep taking a look at jungle. I think I'm going to be tasked with this specifically, but making a shot call on how much actual gank success we want out of junglers, and like taking a look at like, hey, what is the average kill and assist of junglers across servers, across elos, based on what champions they're playing even, right? Like I have access to all this data where I can, crush through tens of millions of games, patch over patch, and be like, okay, cool. I want to target a 20% reduction, or I actually only want to target, like, there's only these 7 champions that are outliers, and actually the rest of these champions are fine, and it's really, we just need to completely crush, like, Rek'Sai and Graves' early gank power. I'm making up, I don't have the data right now. But, like, in 0.15, I expect there to be, unless this does a lot for us, and we're like, actually, we're happy, we're good, a follow-up on early jungle gank access, and then, if there have to be concessions elsewhere to make sure the jungle role still feels good, or, has an appropriate level of power overall, we can do concessions, we can do makeup buffs somewhere else. In fact, there was a change that was briefly on PvE in 13-14 that had a concession buff to junglers that got pulled from the patch, but, there as well. But in addition to systemic nerfs to early jungle ganking and early jungle overall power, right, in addition to, we are generally going to buff the scaling of top laners and a bunch of items that top laners will tend to use. We're going to, on average, nerf a bunch of junglers. So Hecarim, Kindred, Rengar, Rek'Sai are all receiving nerfs in this patch. Hecarim, of course, was already a pretty borderline target, and then, hey, with the fact that an item that he fairly frequently buys getting buffed, he's obviously going to go for it even more often. Hey, let's go ahead and lower some Hecarim value. There were several possible versions of this change list. possible nerfs we could have gone for. At the end of the day, we want Hecarim to be building fighter. That is the healthier version of the champion, where he has a longer combat pattern. He doesn't just one-shot you. He has to go for several rotations of his abilities, and use the W Omnivamp, I guess, to survive through it, whatnot, and just not just be a one-shot machine. And so, like, over time, we've seen E damage go down. And though the rest of his build is a little marusery, he is most commonly building Duskblade first. The unfortunate thing is people are still building Divine Sunderer instead of Trinity Force as their go-to auto attack mythic, and I am really quite sure they are incorrect in doing this. I'm really quite sure that if people went Trinity Force, they would see they would actually like it. It would actually give them that longer combat pattern. It would be a little bit less. The outputs would be a little bit less BS, but I really do believe that Triforce Hecarim is at least comparable to Duskblade in power level, and that people are kind of griefing their fighter builds by going Divine Sunderer still. This item, I think, is actually just not very good. But either way, the most common and most successful of the common Hecarim builds is Duskblade. He's building kind of Assassin, and it's like, okay, well, can we make changes that nudge him back toward fighter? And the thought is that giving him less free armor and MR means he's much more likely to be one-shot himself, unless he builds some durability into the thing. And it could be that this needs like a larger patch's worth of work where it's percent bonus armor MR and the Omnivamp is actually going to scale off of his bonus health, and we give him all these health armor MR ratios to really ensure he's building these kinds of items. But like, we also don't want full tank Hecarim because that's like really boring for everybody and is also a really big pro problem. And so it's like we want him to build attack damage but also build armor and health. And it's like, I'm sure there is a very involved changes out here that would like potentially just destroy Duskblade and make him go build Trinity Force and all these other items. Regardless of the fact that Shojin's getting buffed helps. The fact that he's losing 5 armor MR during W, which probably pushes him towards having to get his durability via his items, helps at least a little bit. But that is the direction of these changes. The goal being, again, you can go down a little bit here. Next is a change to Kindred. So I shipped the Kindred changes in the previous patch, where Kindred needed a nerf. We were targeting about 1% on the champion, if I recall correctly, but I was targeting an elite skewed nerf where they generally perform much better than for the average player. And so nerfing base health, nerfing base armor ended up being about 0.75% win rate. There's some wiggle room because there's only so many games in high elo to get the win rate dialed in really aggressively, but this didn't appear to be an elite skewed change, and so basically it's like, okay, well, a different designer picked up changes for Kindred for this patch, and is looking at Q changes instead. And so it's like, well, we're going to revert this because this didn't do what we wanted. We'd rather nerf Kindred the right amount in the right way, right? In a way that's actually going to nerf Kindred in an elite skewed manner, where Kindred is constantly running up against ban rate and win rate concerns in really, really high MMRs. And if we can, cleanse that, if we can right that, then great. Kindred can be, a successful champion for many more players and not just stuck in sort of high elo hell, essentially. So reverting this change, then having to go for, a nerf of like 1.5%. Plus 0.75% via a Q cooldown nerf via Q damage. We may end up going slightly harder here than what is on PBE currently. We're expecting Trinity Force changes to be about 0.25% win rate in power negative for marksmen such as Kindred. I'll get to that when we get to it, but a change there. But overall, looking to lower Kindred, especially elite skewed. Next is a change to Rengar. So I am shipping the Rengar change in this patch. This champion did get nerfed a bit with the Stormrazor and Essence Reaver changes from 13.13. It did tap Rengar down a little bit. Not enough, but hey, while it was there, like it did do a change. Regardless, of course, Rengar is still doing very, very well. Ultimately, to me, Rengar, I actually like that Rengar builds crit. It means he has a bit of a longer tail to his combat pattern. You think about the ferocity mechanic, right? He wants to build it up and spend it and build it up and spend it. So he has like a natural kit synergy with building up ferocity. You think about how his W works. Like he has a W that can cleanse CC to fight for longer. His W, right, stores gray health and he pops it to heal for longer. Like he's clearly meant to be at, a little bit more of a skirmisher play style than just pure assassin. And if he builds critical strike chance, well, that implies that he wants to land more auto attacks, right? He wants to stay in combat and auto attack more and auto attack more. And so I'm very happy that Rengar is building items like Collector and Stormrazor and Essence Reaver because they come in with long-term combat patterns, right? Because it pushes you toward follow-up auto attacks more than something like Lethality will, where right, if you do a full build of critical strike chance, you do 75% more auto attack damage. You do a full build of Lethality, you are not getting 75% more auto attack damage. There's not enough Lethality for that to happen. So I think it is good that he has the crit incentive. The problem is that the one-shot incentive is too high on the crit builds. That Q basically gives you 95% more damage on 100% crit chance, so he essentially comes in with free crit damage prorated into his Q. This is bring it down to 75%, so it's just a normal prorated crit onto his Q. 75% of his crit chance comes through as the bonus damage. So he's going to do less one-shotting, though of course still going to do plenty of damage. Rengar is very, very, very elite skewed, and also quite late game skewed. He's also better in top lane than in jungle in every single MMR. He's 1 to 2% win rate higher in top lane than jungle, whether you look at low, mid, or ultra high MMR bans. So that is what the base health regen nerf is here for, is to say, hey, this champion specifically, right, you already have your W for recouping losses. You've got plenty of ways of sustaining your health back up, losing out on some base health regen. We have a doc of here's a base stat change and roughly how much base stats equals 1% win rate, just like generally on average. I can be convinced that Rengar cares about base health regen less than other champions. He has other ways of regaining health back anyway. But essentially losing 1 health per 5 is meant to be about 1% win rate, which should disproportionately affect top lane and almost not touch jungle at all. It won't affect his late game really at all either, but meant to be a top lane focused nerf here. And then again, Q damage overall being a Rengar nerf. And then Rek'Sai. It's not here actually. Sorry, the total AD ratio thing is on the E. So this is just 5 damage off W. This is just 5 damage off the Unburrow. So instead of 500, instead of 55 to 115, it's 50 to 110. It's just a tap. It's like, here's 5 damage. This does affect the jungle clear because Burrow deals damage in an AoE, or Unburrow deals damage in an AoE and knocks up the primary target. So if you hit Raptors, hey, by the way, Unburrow is going to do 5 less damage to every single Raptor. You go for Wolves, it's going to do 5 less damage to every single Wolf. But when you go for a gank on an enemy champion and do Unburrow, it's going to do 5 less damage to them as well. Really simple change, but just, hey, 5 less damage to W. A really minor thing, but early game focused nerf here. And then the bigger change to Rek'Sai is Rek'Sai's E is losing 50 base damage, but it's going to scale off of a nerfed total AD ratio instead of a bonus AD ratio. What this means is that Rek'Sai, essentially, if you buy 0 items, it takes until, I think it's like level 12? Around level 8 to, I forget, it's like somewhere mid game though. It takes like level 8 to 12 to equalize the base damage loss just from getting character levels. And considering the bonus AD ratio of 0.85 is going to nerf for a total AD ratio of 0.7, there is no amount of longswords that's going to make up for that. It is just simply going to be less damage, so your levels keep up with it. But generally speaking, Rek'Sai doesn't have a last max. Like, W max sucks. It does nothing, basically. And so Rek'Sai just, like, level 13 is the last level that matters for her. And it's like, yeah, you get like 150 base damage and 5% missing health on R, but like going from 13 to 16 for that is like not a real incentive, right? And there could be like more work done to like really stretch out Rek'Sai's combat pattern and be like, no, we're going to care about your W rank up and we're going to stretch out more of this stuff and, move more of your numbers around, whatever. But like, end of the day, Rek'Sai is still extremely, extremely early game skewed. She is so much about the first like 5 levels of ganks and just guaranteeing obvious kills that you can't escape because of how good tunnels are, and the amount of damage she deals is absurd and just, completely runs over people. I mean, the fact of the matter is, Rek'Sai at level 3 has a 110 true damage single target nuke to go with her 1 second knock up and auto attack reset and higher than normal attack speed pressing Q. Like, rank 1 E is 110 true damage with a 1.7 bonus AD ratio. It then gains 10 true damage per rank. And it's like, well, yeah, no wonder this champion one-shots at level 3. Like, 80% of the power of the ability is there right away. Like, And so by doing this, it stretches it out quite a lot more where, the damage is down like 15 or 20% or something at rank 1. This, of course, will slow down Rek'Sai's jungle clear. You don't learn this ability to level 3, but, if you actually decide to go for a camp after like red-blue Gromp, and you start to kill wolves or something or whatever, okay, well, you're going to do a little less damage to your camp, but really it's like, well, when you go to gank this bot lane, are you going to do like 40 less true damage in the combo, and it's going to be really, really meaningful. So a big hit to Rek'Sai's early gank power, honestly. I think it's really valuable. So what's interesting is, again, I think it's really valuable that every lane has every power curve of early to late game champions. I really don't think it's good to have a lot of sameness of, well, every bot laner scales well, every top laner scales like ass, or every top laner scales well, and vice versa for bot lane. It's good to have Kallistas and Lucians, and also Aphelios' Jinx, and just, make sure that everything is kind of out there. And yeah, if you're in a really fast meta game, Jinx will be bad for a bit. And I think as a design team, we should be willing to accept that. And as players, if you're in a really fast meta game for a little while, maybe you can't play a late game scaler like Jinx or Aphelios for a bit. Or you have to have the right comp for it, where you notice that you have really safe lanes because your top lane's playing Ornn, your mid lane is playing like Orianna, and they can stonewall, and you're going to be able to actually, get a 32-minute game out of it. I think that's reasonable. I think, that like that's just going to be a natural circumstance that's going to happen. And I think that's, something that as players and as designers, everyone should be willing to accept, but it's just, personal opinion. Regardless, I think jungle is a little out of line in how skewed some of the champions are. And I haven't tested this very thoroughly, so like I don't know for sure if like the difference between like Rek'Sai and say like Evelynn is the same as the difference between like Jinx and Callista. I don't know the like disparity of early power versus late power, if it's as extreme or more extreme in one of these lanes or the other. But I do know that really, really overbearing early game junglers seem to ruin the game for everybody else. Because they'll just show up in your lane and kind of kill you. And so I'm pretty sure that champions like Rek'Sai, we need to take pretty big swings at their early game gank power. I believe that's the case. I'm not 100% sure that's true, but in the meantime, we're definitely nerfing Rek'Sai's early gank power because it is certainly way too high. And directionally, we want to generally nerf early game jungle gank power. Okay, so the next sort of bucket of changes is sort of bot lane stuff. Agency is zero sum, so if bot lane goes down, top lane goes up some. A couple of things that I think are really valuable to do. So one of these is a nerf to Gale Force. Initially, there was a change to Gale Force where it was cooldown nerf and a damage nerf on the active. The more I looked at data, I don't think Gale Force needs too big of a nerf. It's just going to be cooldown. So the tough thing with Gale Force is that it's an active item, but it's an active item that actually has... it's actually rather skill expressive. So of course Zhonya's is a very skill expressive active item as well, but something like Gale Force I think is actually very, very skill expressive, where like on reaction you can get away from a Wukong ultimate, or on reaction you can, dodge Malphite ultimate. And it's like, even things like Sivir Spell Shield, regular, like it's instant cast and cannot screw up. Like you can't miss it. Regular players will still miss, Sivir Spell Shield on like an Ornn ulti or a Malphite ulti or something. Gale Force is even harder because you can waste it at a bad time. You can press it in the wrong direction. You can cast it and just like not get out of the radius in time or whatever. And this is fine. It is totally reasonable for parts of the game to be skill expressive. League of Legends is a game that requires skill. The gripe I have is if a skill expressive active item is omnipresent, it means that bad AD carries who are like, not good reflexes, not good at managing active items, are buying this item and failing at it and having a worse time playing League of Legends because they can't do what the item is going to do. And the pro players are untouchable because how the fuck do you outplay a Gale Force Aphelios? He does all the damage. He outduels you with red-white. He outduels you with just green-white with the turret, no matter where you are on the map. Like, he's going to one-shot your team with Inferno. I'm not overstating everything. And then we try to dive him, he Gale Forces away. And by the way, his damage is still so high, he doesn't care that he didn't get crit damage or anything else, or, getting his cooldowns refreshed via quick plates or anything. So it's like, well, okay, we should really probably just balance Gale Force around elite play. You should really just balance Gale Force around elite play. And what's funny is even in elite play, by the way, as much people have been like, oh, XD Infinity is unviable. Last I checked in this is, to be fair, also counting tier 2 leagues, so ERLs and Challenger and stuff. Jinxes pick Infinity Edge about half as often as they pick Gale Force. even at the very, very high ends of gameplay. So like on generic crit marksman, Infinity is actually, actually pretty solid. But Gale Force, again, I think should be balanced around actual elite play, should be balanced around the best users. I actually believe that just for the overall bot lane ecosystem, Gale Force should be the least common mythic. Outside of champions, like it's clearly hard bound on someone like Neela, where Neela clearly wants Gale Force. What's funny is Neela has finally gotten popular because people have gone to Gale Force instead of Shield Bow, or they've realized they can buy Gale Force and Shield Bow via the midseason update. But suddenly Neela's popular because her whole combo just works with Gale Force, which I just find kind of interesting. That like people have like figured out this champion exists and is good. Anyway, it's a random aside, but yeah, TLDR. There's gonna be some champions with like they're really Gale Force champions. This is things like, hey, Jhin Gale Force for a fourth shot, or just Neela overall are probably gonna remain hard bound to this item. But weeding Caitlyn and Jinx off of it towards Infinity Edge, a good thing. Convincing Lucian players that should be going Quick Blades. By the way, every Lucian player who's going Gale Force, you're wrong. Go Quick Blades. Just by the way. But yeah, in general, I believe the game is best when AD carries don't default come with a dash. And so Gale Force being rare is healthier for League of Legends the game. And if you're like, no, trust me, I really need some way to get away from divers because there's just too many, and I literally can't play League unless I can dodge a Malphite ultimate. Because I picked Jinx and they picked Malphite, and I need to dodge this. Okay, here's Gale Force, right? Here is your outlet for, no, I really need a dash. Or in some cases, like, again, Neela exists, and Jhin will probably stay Gale Force, so I could see him going IE. He's probably going Gale Force, though. Like, I think that is a healthier state for the item, and so here's a nerf. It is going to be viable, but it should be below for most champions. Intended, it's what I want. In compensation is a very small buff to Infinity Edge. So essentially, the math is that at 2 items, you do about 1% more auto attack damage and about 1% less ability damage. I spot checked this with Caitlyn. And I spot checked it with, there's one other AD carry, I don't remember off the top of my head, but it was like, okay, well, that's where the numbers are, like, it's fine. It was like Caitlyn and Jinx, where it's like, oh yeah, okay, Jinx, the only AD ratio you have is like the W, which is like not a huge part of your power budget, and already has so much base damage that it doesn't matter. It's like, okay, this is clearly power positive on Jinx, it's at 2 items, maybe neutral on something like Caitlyn, depends on how much your damage is coming from spells, how much your damage is coming from auto attacks, okay, whatever. It's minus 5 AD, it's plus 10% crit damage. The second you buy a Cloak of Agility, now it's like 1.5% more auto attack damage. But then you get to a full build, it's like 3.8% more auto attack damage. At the end of the day, it's like, hey, this is meant to be a relatively power neutral. Again, AD carry is not, like, I think it's relatively balanced at this point. Up to date MMR based agency metrics puts it roughly tied with top lane and definitively behind mid lane. So like a light touch here where top lane gets a bit more agency, jungle overall gets nerfed. I think kind of everyone gets to be happy. I think, again, AD carry is not dashing away from people as much, is experience win for everyone playing against them in terms of like having fun playing against AD carries. And the fact that Caitlyn and Jinx can go from an item that they were currently using to this item instead, and it's just slightly more powerful than before and was already a pretty comparable option. AD carries, again, not terribly weak. I think a little frustrating with how much they are dashing. And overall, this is lightly power positive to the role overall. It is worth noting that game duration scales inversely proportional with MMR. Like Iron games, I think, go about 30 minutes, and Challenger games go on average about 23, I think. I don't remember the exact numbers, but I know there's like a multiple minute difference between the average Iron game and the average Challenger game, and it's just a straight line from Iron to Bronze to Silver, etc., all the way up to Challenger. And so anything where it disproportionately affects you at item 3 and item 4, well, AD carry is more unpopular and a very light touch. It's almost immeasurable, but it's slightly there. It's less popular and a little bit lower agency in lower elos, right? People are worse at peeling. It's a less self-sufficient class. And so, hey, as a class, we slightly gave you more late game scaling on average. Well, AD carriers are going to generally be able to utilize that a bit more in Silver and Bronze than they are going to in Challenger, where the average game actually goes to about 2 items. And obviously, there are some where 15-minute surrenders, and there are some challenging games that go to 3 items, obviously, but that's kind of the mean that we are at. And a lot of games are surrenders. And so if AD carry is OP and high elo, well, cool. We're not buffing AD carry, but AD carry is underperforming and underappreciated in low elo. Well, this strictly buffs AD carry in low elo and is generally pretty positive. Now, again, I would like to give top laners a decent amount of love for their late game as well, but I think directionally this is a pretty solid change. Next thing is a change to Trinity Force. So there's a couple lines here, which is so minus 2% attack speed is not a big change. The big one is here. Okay, so the first update is to threefold strikes. So on live, threefold strikes gives you 4% base AD per auto attack for a cap of 5 stacks at 20% more base AD. The new version is 6% base AD per stack, but only 3 stacks, which caps at 18% base AD. So obviously, right, the first auto attack you're at 6 instead of 4. So, in a really, 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 really short fight, this is a power positive change. No questions asked. Okay, pop quiz. For how many auto attacks, if I'm hitting a target dummy or a turret or just an actual champion, for how many auto attacks is this line a buff? For how many auto attacks is this line 13.14 made me a stronger champion? The answer is 12, because it's, right, 6 versus 4, then 12 versus 8, then 18 versus 12, then 18 versus 16. So for the first 5, it's still better. Then it's 18 versus 20. But even though I'm doing now 2% less AD per hit, these were all happening on the way up. And so it's, right, it's plus 2, plus 6, plus 12, plus 16, minus 2, 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 12 auto attacks until this is actually a nerf tier champion. Most fighters are not going to land 12 auto attacks in their example fight. Maybe if they're alone with the turret, and they're just going to knock this thing down, okay, it's going to stack up, and they're probably going to be able to, if they get to stay on a turret for more than one wave, okay, sure. But even though the stacks stay on for 6 seconds, it is possible to get kited out for long enough that your stacks fall back off. You got to rebuild them back up. Well, stack cap is only 3. You're going to get them back. And so for the vast majority of fighters, this is a strict buff to all of their combat patterns. When you get your second Sheen proc out and your base AD is higher because you got 3 autos and it's 18 instead of 12%, well, congratulations. That Sheen proc is stronger as well. Cool. You're stronger. You're stronger. You're stronger. Marksmen are more likely to have a 12 auto attack long team fight. It's much more likely. They will tend to have more attack speed. They'll tend to have Berserker Screams. They're going to tend to have a Kraken Slayer. In fact, the 2 most common Trinity Force users in bot lane are Kraken Slayer Triforce Ashe and Kraken Slayer Triforce Kindred. Okay, not bot lane, but ranged marksman users, right? And then Draven is like the 3rd most popular. And then for Ezreal, it doesn't really matter. Actually, it's probably a power positive Ezreal. He's not going to stay stacked for all that long. Okay, it's power positive Ezreal. Cool, congratulations. Whatever. It's fine. But for every fighter, it's clearly a buff. So, okay, knowing that it's clearly a buff, and that for marksman, it was going to be probably a side grade, right? A decent number of fights were going to be short, decent number of fights were going to be long. This isn't really, obviously strictly different. So minus 2% attack speed. It's not a lot. It's really for the meme number of it being 3% attack speed. But yeah, it's a bunch of small taps. This is probably like 0.25% win rate down for marksman on average. Because think about it, if you do this item on Kindred, let's say you actually rush Trinity Force first item on Kindred, you get it, 12, 14 minutes into the game, whatever. Hey, while you're clearing the jungle, you just have 2% less attack speed. Is it a huge deal? No, of course not. When you start the fight out, we get 2% less attack speed. Now you might have more base AD, right? Your base AD is up by, if you have like 100 base AD, it's up by 2, then it's up by 4, then it's up by 6, and you're doing more damage each of these auto attacks, but you also have 2% less attack speed, so you're not stacking it quite as fast. You're not dealing quite as much overall auto attack damage. Whereas someone like Jax, he comes with a bunch of free attack speed, he has auto attack resets, he's, a bit more bursty in the first place anyway. Overall, I think this is, again, very, very lightly powered down to marksmen and probably pretty much neutral to fighters because they are clearly going to be stronger for the first 10 auto attacks of a fight with, a little concession made for a slightly lower attack speed. One other change I actually forgot to write down here, let's put it in, is Static Shiv, and it's plus 5 AS, and then 250 to 450 is 250 to 350 on the lightning damage. So we'll start with this one. So Static Shiv is, so it was tuned really aggressively to where it would not quite one-shot cast minions unless you were ahead of the curve on XP in top or mid lane, which gave it as much power as possible for bot lane. Unfortunately, it meant you could just go minion dematerializer, and which I saw day one, I like watch, hey, here's the LCS on 13.13, and I watch Gory, and he goes Materializer, and I'm like, oh shoot. So yeah, Dematerializer kind of breaks this interaction, and so it was actually a pretty heavy nerf to lightning damage. So on live, Static Shiv is 250 points of damage until level 6. And then at level 7, it's plus 25. At level 8, it's plus 25. At level 9, it's plus 25. And in that game, as an example, Gorion LeBlanc built Static Shiv at level 9, which means it was 250, 7, 8, 9. It was 375. Or no, sorry, 325, right? It's plus 75 damage, so it's actually 325 damage at level 9. Ooh, that's a really high number. And it turns out that with a Dematerializer on a caster minion, you definitely one-shot caster minions there. AD carries will tend to finish the item around level 6 or 7. It depends on like if they're really snowballing. If they get a bunch of kills, they can get it, quite a couple levels early. But like if a well farming mid laner gets it at 9, a well farming AD carry gets it around level 7. Assuming again you don't get kills or farm plates or whatever. And that was initially why I set the item to be flat at levels 1 through 6, and then scale up from 7 onwards. The idea behind that was, okay, what is the actual baseline value? Like, let's not have a fake tooltip number where it's never going to deal 12 damage, it's only going to be level 1 ever. But hey, if you get really ahead of the curve and you like get a pentakill and you get this item early, when you get a level 5 version of the item, it hasn't scaled yet. But then you get level 6, hasn't scaled. You get level 7, okay, now it goes up, right? So like the average AD carry gets level 7 version of the item, which is 275. But if you got really ahead, you got it early, you get a 250, even though you're not meant to reach that. But like, well, here's an intentionally deflated number. But the problem with that is it means that you always have this very obvious overhang where the mid lane is going to do a lot more damage than the bot laner does. So the new version is now flat at level 8. It's 250 at level 8, and then it's just plus 10, plus 10, plus 10, plus 10, plus 10, all the way to 350. Which means that when Gori buys his level 9, it's 260, not 325. And when an AD carry buys this at level 7, instead of 3, I guess it would have been, to be fair, 275, it's 250. It's not that different, right? So right for a mid lane LeBlanc, again, the difference is 260 instead of 325, it's 65 lower. And then for AD carry buying it like level 7, it's 250 instead of 275, it's 25 lower. Much less hurtful, obviously, right? And then, okay, yeah, it's 10 per level, so 25 per level. So, you start, it starts moving on from there. And that's why plus 5 AS is here, right? So Static Shiv is actually not a weak item. It's very good on Quinn. It's very good on Vayne. It's very good on Ashe, interestingly. It's very good on Sivir. There's actually, it's good on Jinx as well. I know people are really going on to Kraken Slayer. They're really enjoying it as, it does the thing you think an AD carry should do, which is single target damage. But honestly, Static Shiv is not a weak item. And so, though it is, of course, objectively getting weaker in the hands of marksmen, it is getting 5% attack speed back, which should keep it relatively power neutral. Shiv, again, is actually a totally reasonable item. People calling it bad are just incorrect. I have the data, I have the numbers, I have the champions, and the item's fine. But it one-shots minion waves in too many situations, and so it's getting walked back by around 20% damage, and it'll get to the point where it's not going to one-shot minion waves outside of really, really extreme situations where it's probably not possible. One thing I want to bring up is someone mentioned like, hey, but why doesn't it have an AP ratio? It's like, okay, well, outside of exactly LeBlanc, this thing hasn't really been abused. It has an AP ratio to be a hybrid item, right? Like people... Like, I've had a lot of people come out and say they've really, really, really enjoyed playing hybrid Varus, hybrid Kai'Sa. And the fact that, this has been able to drive an interesting LeBlanc build of going for Lichbane and caring about auto attacks is, like, conceptually kind of interesting that there are unique builds out there. Yasuo and Yone, theoretically, hopefully can use this item in, long term as well. But, the end of the day, like, yes, here is an item that is good on conventional crit-based marksmen and is also a cool hybrid Lichbane for hybrid champions, where it gives you attack damage stats and has a proc that is decent on its own to like make the item playable, but also, since someone who builds an Asher's Tooth cannot use crit chance in any way, unless they build Razed Blade later, okay, well, these items literally cannot multiply each other in any way at all. My unhit damage and crit chance cannot multiply. Well, they get to combine on an item called Static Shiv, and hey, we have a hybrid build. And realistically, it's like, okay, we had to tune the... okay, my mistake for giving the minion damage an AP ratio. That's my goof. I shouldn't have had that. I shouldn't have done that. That was wrong of me. Shouldn't have had an AP ratio. Okay, basically, one retuning of the proc damage and balanced item is like not that bad. I know it's been in the patch notes a lot. Again, there were a lot of missteps here. I didn't think of all of the possible permutations of builds, and obviously it had some abuse cases, but I think it looks to be in a pretty good spot, and it's pretty fine. Next, in a minor bot lane nerf, is individual champion change to Karthus. This is just, hey, Karthus bot lane has been growing and growing in power. One change you may have seen on PvE was, it's not going this patch, is changing the defensive stat shards from flat armor and flat magic resist to a single shard that is hybrid armor and MR. So part of what has Karthus and a lot of other mages in bot lanes win rate so high is that on average, 60% of bot lane carry players, like you looking at Aphelios, Jinx, Ashe, Ezreal, like is pretty average across all of them. About 60% of them run the armor stat shard against mage bots like Seraphine, Karthus, and Ziggs. In Masters Plus, it's still around 35%. Obviously, your amount of sample gets lower and lower, so you get like kind of spiky variation. But it averages out to about, even in Masters Plus, the very best players in the game, they identify like, oh, well, I see a Jace in the mid lane, and I see a Wukong, and I see a Karthus in my lane, and they will only 1/3 of the time run MR down in the bot lane. Now, the vast majority of Karthus are not playing alongside Pyke and Senna. It's a double AP bot lane, and they're like, I'm gonna run armor down here. And of course, right, the master level players run MR more often than the low MMR players do, right? Like they are correctly identifying, but still with very, very poor perfection, are clearly not running the right shard. They're not doing it. And to me, that is not a terribly interesting choice to make in the first place anyway. It's, did you realize that Karthus is there? Did you change your page, yes or no? And I am going to guess, so this will not change until preseason, but I will probably be tasked with at some point figuring out what we want all those runes to be, and at the end of the day saying it's going to be a hybrid resist shard or something, but essentially getting rid of the armor or MR choice. And the fact that so many people get the armor or MR choice wrong is actually inflating the win rate of champions like Karthus, Ziggs, Swain, etc. Right, because a majority of their champion matchups in most games, they're against the wrong stats, right? They're not against the +8 MR that they're supposed to be against. So there's some win rate inflation there. But Karthus is far too high win rate in really high elo, where people do tend to pick the correct stat shards, and so room for a Karthus nerf while preserving Karthus jungle. And so a little bit of minus Q damage is a -2 to 0. It's very, very little. But -5 mana on the E mana restore. These add up to a pretty meaningful hit to bot lane Karthus in terms of how much damage your Q deals. A little bit in PvP, of course in PvE as well, just the amount of mana you have overall. It's a tap down and then +5% outgoing damage on the monster mod here from 95% to 100% means that overall Karthus jungle should be relatively unaffected. This will affect him some, right? He's going to earn 5 less mana per individual jungle monster, so like, I don't know, 15 individual monsters, something like that, across the jungle. You're going to have 75 mana. You're going to have like 3 fewer lay wastes in your clear. This will objectively slow him down, although the monster mod with the AP from stat shards and everything else, he's going to be fine, right? Karthus jungle will not move very much. It actually might be power positive, considering that like from your second clear onwards, you're clearly just going to be faster. As you get AP, you're clearly just going to be faster. But of course, again, lower restore there. Another bot lane, agency sort of nerf going down is Ghost. My Twitter is basically unusable. I assume threads won't be any better, where I just get absolutely inundated with angry people who are like, XD Phreak, you just keep buffing AD carry. And it's like, dog, I did that in maybe 2 patches. And I look at the patch history. I have absolutely 100% shipped more nerfs to AD carry systems than buffs to AD carry systems in my time at Riot. I am extremely confident that is true. Maybe I'm wrong, but I'm pretty confident this is true, that I've shipped more systemic nerfs to AD carry than systemic buffs to AD carry. What's nice is all the changes combined have still generally raised bot lane Q rates, which in some servers are quite low. Some servers just have low AD carry populations, which is part of the changes from 13.1b, why this whole thing started back in the day. But right, systemically trying to bring the classes into line, again, here's another one. And so this is basically saying, hey, the takedown extension on Ghost is something that is ranged champion skewed, right? It's skewed towards champions who are going to live throughout the entire team fight, who are going to get a kill, right? Have the target access to have damaged someone recently, get the kill and assist, and then get the thing, right? So like if you're ranged, if you have AoE, if you have buffs, you're going to get assists much more easily, and you're going to stay alive to keep Ghost refreshed and care about the extension. These are all ringing alarm bells as bot lane, bot lane, bot lane. This is a bot lane thing. As compensation, it's essentially giving roughly 1 takedown for free on the base duration. Base duration is going from 10 to 15. Now, there could have been other versions of this where the base duration was actually 10 to 20 based on champion level, and there was no takedown extension, so that like the level 16 Darius just gets a 17-second ghost. It's fine, just have it. There could have been a different version of this one that like maybe was slightly better designed, but had another level scaling lever on it. Might have been correct. Regardless, though, no takedown extension. I think pretty reasonable here. The plus 5 seconds of the duration again is meant to make good for solo laners running it, or melee champions running it, where like this is meant to be pretty neutral on Garen or Singed or Darius or whomever, but power negative on Zeri, who cannot just have 35 seconds of ghosting because she got 4 takedowns on everyone else. And so trying to lower the overall snowballiness that like not everyone is Jinx, not everyone just has get excited on their summoner spell. This also will tend to push bot lane a bit more toward defensive summoners. It's worth noting that the durability update is, I think, a lot of what brought us into an enchanter meta in pro play, that when you suddenly cannot win all lanes against your lane opponents, you just play the ranged champions that are going to outscale the tanks anyway. Right? Like, why bother playing Leona when you can play Yuumi, not die anyway, and have better scaling? It's logical. That's one of the big things that Durability Update did, was essentially buff enchanters, especially in pro play. And so there's a little bit of caution around how much is allowed to happen here. How, if we're seeing heal barrier or heal exhaust again, does that stymie aggression in bot lane again? Because being able to kill your lane opponent, this is what happened in 13.3 or 13.4, where we buffed a bunch of tank supports to try to get the support metagame back towards tanks. So we got there, right? We got back to 2-1 by MSI by taking very obvious direct changes to support and saying, okay, we're going to make some enchanters a bit squishier, and we're going to make some engagers do more damage. And I want to point out, by the way, like the Lulu changes in 13.13 or 0.12, I think 0.12, if I recall correctly, it was nerfing her early picks damage, nerfing her early, I think it was health and armor, maybe it was just armor, but giving her E rank up shield back. This was less than a 1% win rate nerf to Lulu. She lost like 0.7% win rate and almost entirely disappeared from pro. She was like the number 2 pro play champion for support, or like number 3, right behind Milio. And though like we dropped Milio a whole bunch in power, we dropped Yuumi a whole bunch in power, she could be taking over as number 1 support. She lost like 0.7% win rate. Nope, she's gone because early durability is not a very big solo queue lever, but a really, really big pro play lever. And so this is one thing that we have to kind of keep in mind of like, hey, how fragile, how durable is bot lane? And I know it's a pain point. Like I've seen complaints from Sono players who feel really bad how squishy they are, but it also allows Sono to be strong and not a pro viable champion because she's squishy enough that pro Leonas will just kill her, and regular Leonas are worse at that. So it's a delicate balance. It's something that certainly our eyes are on, but it's going to move the game to a less snowbally direction. And that is something as well that we might look at in the future, is snowballiness overall. Not sure. There are also some changes to supports. I also shipped these two, or am shipping these two support nerfs to both Milio and Rel. This is, again, I said it at the very beginning of the video, if you missed it, this is one of the primary pro play playoff patches. 13.14 is, I believe, LCK playoffs, if I recall correctly. And Rel and Milio are the number 1 and 2 supports in pro play. Right behind them, we have, I think, Rakan and Nautilus, which is pretty cool. Those are good champions as well. But essentially, it's, hey, look, Rel, we put changes in the previous patch. We tried to bring up her jungle. We tried to bring down her support. We did not bring down her support by enough. She is like a 54% win rate support in Elite. It is clearly too high. She's also number 1 in Pro, but it's largely driven by solo queue, because I think it's fine if Rel's number 1 Pro support. I think it's reasonable, but she's too good. She's like at minimum 52%, even in low MMR. Like, she's clearly too good, and so we want to swing relatively hard. And Rel has been the hardest balance change for me to ship so far, because so many of her numbers are at kind of the low end. So She has low base MR for a melee champion. She has rather low base armor for a support. Almost every other support has more than her. Rakan has less, but Rakan is much more mobile. Rel's damage are all very, very low. Her single highest rank 1 damage is 60. That is not a large number. I think her ult only deals like 120 total damage. Like, that's not high. I'm pretty sure Malphite is like 200. I think Leona is higher. I think Nautilus is higher. Her damages are low. Her base stats are low. I guess she has, 330 base move speed. She has 5 over like Alistar and Nautilus. Okay, that's something, but she self slows when in unmounted form, so she's pretty slow. Her attack speed's low. What's really, really sacred about this champion is moving fast. That this was the one thing we really had to deliver. I say we, I didn't have a really big hand in it. In the mid scope was that Rel, the horse girl, should be fast. And so, not that we couldn't nerf move speed, but it's really, really sacred that she is fast, and she probably should be the fastest support in League of Legends. She literally rides a horse. If you're slower than someone else, someone has screwed up if we designed that away. That would have been me if I over nerfed it, right? It's like, and look, I'm sure there are designable levers that can move around to remove some power here, right? And if it's like, hey, Phreak, take a patch, you have time to, ship a bunch of text changes to localization and rework some mechanics. But like, Rel is not an unsolvable problem, right? With no mechanics changes, Rel went from a 48% support to a 54% support. Clearly, numbers changes can get us there. That's clearly possible, right? She got micro patch buffed and then, a bunch of other stuff. The Q got hastened. Okay, that was pretty meaningful, but like, clearly numbers changes can be there, but again, just some things are kind of sacred. And basically just like finding numbers that we were comfortable with that would feel okay. And what we settled on ultimately is -3 armor, and 1/3 of the power off of her passive. So a 3% steal per hit is a 2% steal per hit. A minimum steal of 1.25 to 3 is now a minimum steal of 0.8 to 2. It's a 1/3 hit across the board. Technically, this does mean that she's going to steal 0.45 less armor when in the jungle clear. So, when she's killing Gromp, it's going to have, 2 or something less, more armor and MR, and you're going to have 2 less armor and MR, so you'll take a little bit more damage when clearing. It's not a big deal, but this technically will nerf jungle Rel some. It's fine. Jungle Rel is an acceptable spot in win rate. It's not really worth the compensation at this point right now. But essentially trying to nerf Rel a meaningful amount, hoping for 1.5 to 2%, at least especially in elite play. But I would still love if Rel is a popular champion pro play. I think she's really cool. I think she's really cool overall. She's actually got pretty healthy counterplay. You can CC her out of a lot of her combos, whatnot. I think she's a really cool champion. I'm glad that we see her around. I think she's a great champ. Just, again, a little bit too strong. Okay, a lot too strong, to be fair. The other one is Milio. Milio is essentially I think he's the most banned support in pro play, which makes it a little bit stale. Also, we're pretty sure Milio is, can be a successful champion, like one who is enjoyed, well-liked, like people are going to enjoy playing him at 48 or 49% win rate. Like, he can sit sub 50 and be comfortable. And we're essentially trying to whittle down on the parts that are extraneous for an enchanter. Right? Milio has an AoE cleanse that gets rid of suppression. Like, he has a giant AoE heal that's not tied to an ultimate. He empowers his allies. Like, he is clearly a very, very good defensive support, and that is great. Like, cool. Milio is a really, really good defensive support. He's all about helping his teammates out. That's his entire motif, right? He's a very joyful kind of champion. Like, it's all on theme. Generally haven't nerfed his defensive outputs yet, because I don't think we should. If he's frail in the early game, in the 1v1s or the 2v2s, if he's a weak early laner, that has a lot of purchase in how much that affects pro play. Pro play is really sensitive to the laning phase of their supports. It's why we started seeing Ashe and Varus for a little bit, because they are really actually good at dueling other ranged champions, because it turns out that Ashe can auto-attack trade against Soraka really easily, right? Like, we got into that weird state early on when you just couldn't play Pyke and Leona. But essentially what I looked at was, okay, well, the burn damage goes down by, it's about 1/3 I forget exactly, but it's a pretty meaningful cut to his passive. It's minus 10 to minus 30. The level 18 is kind of fake on Melio. But it's hey, your ability to give someone a shield, like a basically nearly full value shield, but also give them like 20 damage in the trade back. Yeah, okay, actually 25 minimum was the number. Oh, that's the best trading tool in the game. Press E on your AD carry, then press E on them later. By the way, this is the thing. And it's the fact that what one thing I explored was so E lasts 2.5 seconds, and the hastes lasts as long as the shield does. The entire buff's 2.5 seconds, and if you recast E before the duration, lapses, you cast it after 2.25 seconds. You refresh the buff and double it, right? Like you add your new shield on top, and you essentially double the move speed for the next 2.5 seconds, which means that this guy's the possibility of giving someone like 25% move speed for 2.5 seconds. Is my math right? Am I and then another 25% move speed for the next 2.5 seconds. It's like, this is an extremely large amount of move speed for an extremely large amount of time, which scales off the coordination with your ally because you're empowering them to do their job, and it's move speed, which is a really elite skewed output, right? Your ability to kite back and forth and stay in range and stay out of their range and get your auto attacks off and apply Melio passive, and then after the auto attacks comes in, wait the right amount of time, put the E back on, apply another Melio passive. It's like this entire trading pattern gives Melio a really, 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 really good laning phase and a lot of power for lane bullying. And so to me, these are really, really good levers for removing that. Now, it is probably not correct to disentangle the move speed duration from the shield duration, because then it like lapses, but you can put it back on. Does it still double the value? It's kind of wonky, and it just hurts the learnability of the skill. So yeah, the E move speed is actually quite long for a move speed boost. Like Karma is 2.5 second shield with a 1.5 second move speed duration. Melee is 2.5 second shield with 2.5 second move speed duration, and it stacks, so it can be a 5 second move speed duration, right? Like that's clearly very, very good, which means the number can be a lot lower, and so the overall number on the move speed that's going down. Again, passive damage. Melio is a very, very good defensive support, enhancing support. He doesn't need to provide as much flat damage, which cool, great. That's the change. So those are the changes to supports. And then there's some miscellaneous changes. I did not have a direct hand in pretty much any of these, but we can kind of go over them pretty quickly. I'm going to have much less context on these. So up first, Diana, plus flat shield, plus W ratio on the damage. I believe there's also a ratio here. So the flat and ratio on the shield, ratio on the W damage, ratio on the E damage. Diana is kind of weak everywhere. So just very much strict buffs here. I think she's a cool champion. Glad that she's getting buffs. Lysandra is a bunch of QOL and some definite actual power. So now the Thralls will not stop to animate the auto attack when they are at the end of their lifetime to blow up. So they will remain in range for more. Now all of the Q slows, including passing through onto minions. This certainly can matter quite a bit. Having AoE slow in a team fight can certainly do quite a bit. We'll see how that does. And both the flat heal and especially the ratio on R is being amped quite a lot, just to make self-R'ing a little bit less of a trap. The base heal is up very, very little, but the ratio is up like double. So that, yeah, if you're going to use R as a self-heal, it's a little bit less bad, although still not amazing. I think there's a really good chance we see quite a lot of Lysandra after this change. I think this is the kind of thing we're going to see Lysandra as probably a top 4 champ in pro play in mid. That's going to be my shot call here. Okay, I think she's going to be number 1 right away, but this is going to be basically a mid laner who is very utility focused in a mid lane, which means it will create a metagame which is much more about having big carries elsewhere, and we'll probably see more carry jungles, more carry top laners. Every 80 carry is always carry. So this actually opens up a lot more, I think, carry slots in other roles here with Lysandra, because she can play the crowd control role. It also means that squishy champions are even more threatened because she's essentially a diver. So we'll see what happens with this one. Shaco AD buff here, basically plus Q damage. I think it's plus the ratio and the crit modifier on the backstab, something like that. I forget exactly, but essentially plus damage on the Q, scaling with how much AD he has, and then also making Prowler's Claw, if it's ready, there's like a marker on it, and having that replicate onto the clone as well. So there's one fewer way to identify. One less way to identify that it is the clone and not the real Shaco. If he goes Prowler's Claw, of course, Prowler's Claw, a weak item on Shaco right now. Part of that being the clone, part of that being Prowler's Claw is weak, part of that being AD Shaco is not very good. I would like if we nerfed AP Shaco at some point. It's not incredibly urgent. In fact, Shaco's win rate will drop, possibly, if AP Shaco players move over to AD Shaco, because I don't believe it's going to get I don't think it's going to get AD Shaco like a 50% win rate champion, but I think AP Shaco is like a 50% win rate champion, so We'll see. Ichigo has been the more popular build. Either way, likely going to be a ban of mine coming up in the next patch. Next is the AD Shyvana sort of patchwork update. So this is plus 80 ratio on the Q. This is Q gives attack speed. A light nerf to the Q cooldown, though clearly going to be a stronger ability overall, since especially since attack speed can feed into lowering your Q cooldown on its own. The attack speed is capped like only a small number of attacks. This still feeds into this change. And then there is now a bonus AD gives percent health, more percent health damage on the proc ratio on the E. So substantial buffs to AD Shyvana. I think some really cool changes here. Also, a patchwork update to Xerath, basically a flat mana nerf and a flat passive cooldown nerf. So that if you do not kill minions, you have less mana and less mana restore. These are pretty much direct Xerath support changes. Okay, sure. You can apply your passive on turrets, which, to be fair, I think is actually going to affect Xerath support more than Xerath as a mid laner. But whatever, it's fine. This was known. Someone brought up, like, hey, what's it going to do? Yes, probably going to affect support. That's probably okay. We're probably okay with this one. +1 cast on the R. The base damage down very slightly, but every successive hit with R is going to do bonus damage if you land it. So you can get a lot of extra damage if you are good at aiming it. I just think this is a cool thing overall. I think Xerath having more R cast just makes the champion much, much more fun. These are just levers that shift him away from support toward mid, which I think is all cool stuff. Of course, his ability to survive Zed is unchanged. His ability to clear waves. I mean, he's going to get more passives as compensation for having a bit less base mana. Relatively neutral, but yeah, I think really cool stuff. Obviously, being better at artillery is a clear cool strength, and I think a really nice thing for our boy Xerath. And then an update to Zyra. The big thing is that she's going to be a much, much better jungler. So this is a quick tabulation on monster damage. So on live, Zyra plants do 50% more damage to monsters that is being replaced by a flat change. Zyra's plant damage, by the way, is 20 to 100 plus 15% AP. So 50% of that is 10 to 50 plus 7.5% AP. Now it is simply 40 to 100, which means plants now do 60 damage per hit to monsters at the start of the game. That is a lot. This 50 to 100, so this actually, I griefed the math here, I think, a little bit. Either way, 7.5% ability power, I believe takes 666 AP to either hit 50 or 100. I forget which one. I did the math. Either way, it's a lot of ability power to make up the difference in base damage and AP ratio. It is a lot. This is very clearly a buff. Even if it's not like a big buff late game at like 3 item, Zyra is suddenly worse at damaging jungle monsters. It's fine, right? Like, it's clearly a buff then. So Zyra in the jungle is coming up. Cool stuff there. Zyra jungle, definitely a strict buff. Next thing is you get 2 seeds right away on learning W. This is, of course, a big Zyra buff as well. Keep in mind, Zyra's pass is going to put a bunch of seeds down in the jungle. You press Q, you summon like 3 or 4 plants, you go kill your blue buff, then you go to kill Gromp, and guess what? You've got 2 seeds, so you can run away, press Q, put out 2 W seeds, or maybe you wait and you go 1-1 since plants have diminishing return if they're hitting the same target. Maybe it's like QW, and then you wait for the next Q, and you QW again. Depends on how your passive times out. I don't know. I'm not optimizing the jungle path here, but obviously pretty valuable here for the jungle clear because you're going to really, really use the plants to knock down camps. But also going to matter a fair bit to support Zyra since she's going to, hit level 2 and go for a QW or an EW, and she can put 2 Ws down instead, which is going to be much stronger. Another big upgrade is you can E plus flash. It's probably going to be a little bit of a high elo skew change, but E has a very long cast time. And also it's pretty slow travel time, which means highly skilled players will have a really, really easy time of dodging Zyra's route. The fact that you can E-flash it means she doesn't have to care as much about the cast time because you can maybe cast it from fog. And she doesn't have to care as much about the slow travel time because it's now going to spawn 450 units closer to the target overall, which heavily lowers the amount of time you can spend time doing this, of course. So you can how much time you have to dodge away. So pretty big buffs there. This is honestly pretty large Zyra changes. Obviously a really, really big jungle buff, but a meaningful support buff here as well. So pretty big update there. We'll see if Zyra has to be nerfed afterwards, but I think definitely some really cool changes for feels. Also, W plants will no longer get 2-shot by AoE abilities. So instead of doing 4 out of 8 health, they will do 3 out of 8 health. Although auto attacks are getting increased from 4 damage to 5 damage on ranged champions. So like an AoE spell plus an auto will still kill the plant off as a small level of concession. But in terms of dying to, like, I think MFE would nearly 2-shot them. MFR I think would 2-shot them. It's just less aggressive now, though. Either way, I think fairly reasonable overall. Just kind of worth noting that that's how this all works out. There's some other minor stuff around how the R updates, but this is like the meaningful changes overall to Zyra. As I mentioned, there were changes to some fighter items, specifically one of two champions who actually buys Spear Trojan right now is Jax. Jax is winning a fair bit. I'm actually pretty happy that Jax is a pro mainstay. He's a pretty cool champion. Definitely has a lot of agency over the game, has some carry potential, and I'm just very happy to have late game carries be a good, like, a relatively common role in pro play. I think it's great that we see a lot of top lane damage champs up there, because top lane is, I think, better than people give it credit for. I think, again, there are some experiential hiccups and rough parts, but I think it's overall pretty solid. And, seeing pro play a bunch of carries and do well, I think it's really good. But Jax is doing too well. So plus on the E cooldown, I think this is flat 1 second cooldown increase. It could be something else. I'm not certain, but one of the items he's going to buy is getting stronger. And so this is less power in the early game, a little bit less power in the late game as well. So overall, fewer counter-strike casts. It's a pretty small change. We maybe could go harder, but I don't think Jax is incredibly overbearing, and he does good things for pro play, in my opinion. So, okay. I mean, overall, like, Shojin is stronger. Jax gets a 1 second cooldown. Nerf on E is still a net nerf to Jax. Same for the changes to Hecarim as well, of course. And then one of the other suggestions from a designer last week before the break was that lethality items were in kind of a bad spot. I did some investigation on which items just really, really, really weren't purchased. Axiom Arc and Prowler's Claw were the two biggest ones. We had other potential changes. We could have nerfed Edge of Night. We could have buffed Umbral Glaive. I think we decided that Umbral Glaive would require more work than just saying, let's do simple buffs. And Edge of Night we didn't think needed to be nerfed right away, but hey, here's some minor buffs to Assassins overall, buffs to the Assassin overall place. Prowler's Claw, of course, didn't really land in a very good spot in midseason. So I think, glad that we're finally coming back and addressing this. I've, of course, been habitually looking at AD carry items and adjusting things when needed. It's why we've had AD carry items in almost every single patch, because if I see something like, it's a little bit out of line, okay, we'll nudge here. It's a little bit out of line, we'll nudge there. Like, I've been really kind of hyper-focused on that one. We haven't had someone really hyper-focused on Assassins right now. People have been pretty busy with preseason. And I just haven't been putting my eyes there. So, but identified intelligently by designer here. And so Prowler's Claw plus lethality is a pretty small buff. Axiom Arc is basically at 2-ish items is stronger. So this is, right, you need 15%. It's what, 40 lethality is 16. So if you get 40% of 40 lethality, you get a buff here. So yeah, it's going to require about 3 items. That's fine. Axiom Arc is kind of more of a second, third item kind of thing. I'm kind of glad it's actually moving toward a kind of assassin capstone and away from, like, you just splash this to get your ultimates more. I think it's actually directionally a good thing to say, hey, it's got stat binding on its core stat. I mean, it's gonna innately come in at 13, right? It 40% of, or it's, I guess, 18 lethality, so 40% of 18 is, I mean, it's still about 8. Whatever. It's still like 12, 13. On itself instead of 20, and then again, as you get more items, it gets better. I think overall a pretty cool change here. I think it's really cool, and it makes it a nice assassin capstone of, like, hey, what this does, by the way, is give you a bunch of ulti cooldown refresh, which I think is really cool. So I think that's a really good change overall. Yeah, that's a very, 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 very long patch preview. Not really worth a TLDR. Each one has their own context that I think is worth listening to. So maybe you thought we'll skip around. I don't know. Thanks for watching, everyone. Bye bye.